The nurse read my file. Then she looked at me, barely breathing, tubes in my nose, and she said, "Your parents signed nothing. They left." I don't remember the crash, just the bitter metal taste in my mouth. The cold of the ER, the fluorescent light slicing through my eyelids, and Sarah, my friend, sobbing beside me, signing forms with shaking hands. But what I remember most was waking up 2 weeks later, alone. No flowers. No calls. No family. I wasn't supposed to wake up. They said I had less than a 10% chance. My brain had swelled. I was on the edge of death. That's when my mother told the doctors, "She's not really our daughter." And my father said, "We've done enough. She's not our responsibility." They walked out, left me there, to die. And Lily just followed them. They all knew. And they walked away. The hospital bill, paid by Sarah, and a GoFundMe I never approved. The decisions left to a nurse named Rachel, who whispered to me every shift like I could hear her. She's the one who believed in the flicker of life in me when my own blood didn't. And while I was learning to walk again, to speak without stuttering, to remember my name without confusion, my parents were in Cambridge cleaning out my grandmother's Victorian home, claiming her things, making funeral plans, whispering about the inheritance. I watched the footage later. Hospital security. My mother's coat. Her voice flat as ice. "No, we're not signing. She has no legal relation to us. Let her go. I was adopted." That part wasn't new. But I had never imagined they'd use it to erase me. They didn't just walk out on my life, they came back for the money. Grandma Margaret had passed. And they arrived with Lily ready to sign papers, smile for lawyers, pose like a grieving family. But I had been there first, and I had left them a note. If someone erased your name, would you write it back in? Or walk away? Would you fight back? Or let them win? What would you do if your family erased you when you were most vulnerable? Would you leave quietly or leave something behind? Share your story below. Subscribe for more true stories of justice, closure, and empowerment from women like you. I grew up in a white colonial house just outside Boston. 4 windows across the second floor, always polished. A black front door with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. My father insisted on fresh hydrangeas every spring. The house looked perfect. But I never belonged in it. Diane and Paul Carter, my parents, had style. People stopped them after church to compliment their clothes, their poise, their daughters. Lily would smile like a pageant queen. I'd stand behind her, too tall, too quiet. She was their miracle child. I was their paperwork. Adoption wasn't a secret, but it was treated like a footnote. A reminder. When I got sick at 7 and needed surgery, my mother said to a nurse, "She's not biologically ours, but of course we'll pay." Of course. I remember the Christmas when I gave them both hand-drawn portraits. They praised Lily's glittery snow globe art like it belonged in a gallery. Mine folded and tossed with the wrapping paper. I stopped making art after that. Lily was funny and loud and messy in ways people found adorable. When she spilled red punch on the couch, my mother laughed. When I forgot to vacuum the stairs, my father made me redo the entire hallway. I learned to be precise, clean, predictable. Because good enough was never enough for me. They told their friends I was a genius, but never told me I was loved. At school, I disappeared into numbers and code. Logic made sense. Inputs matched outputs. No one asked if you were someone's real daughter in math class. I graduated early, won a scholarship, moved to Seattle before I turned 20, far enough that I wouldn't hear the echoes of Lily's success stories at Sunday dinners. Still, I called. On birthdays, on their anniversary. Sometimes they picked up, other times they forgot I existed. I tried not to take it personally. But when my father sent me a holiday card that said "Love Diane, Paul, and Lily," and not me something cracked, it wasn't just being excluded, it was how natural it seemed for them. As if I'd never been part of their picture at all. Seattle was rain and quiet. I liked both. My apartment was small, 3rd floor overlooking an alley where someone always burned sage. The building creaked in winter. I worked late coated in silence, drank tea from a chipped mug I refused to replace. No one there called me a disappointment. No one called me much at all. And yet I felt free. I joined a team of engineers at a mid-sized software firm. Not glamorous, but stable. I solved problems. Taught myself to lead meetings. Eventually they trusted me with major updates, things that actually mattered. Every paycheck felt like proof. Proof I could survive without approval. Without applause. I sent birthday gifts home. Books for Lily. Scarves for Diane. A bottle of scotch for Paul. He never said thank you, but I knew he drank it. The empty bottle showed up once in a photo Lily posted. Still, I didn't go back. I told myself it was about distance. Time zones. Work. The truth, I couldn't risk showing up and being invisible again. Then came February 2022. The roads were slick that morning. I had a client meeting in Redmond. I remember the traffic light flashing yellow, the van swerving, the scream that wasn't mine. The world turned white. When I opened my eyes again, everything was too bright. My body didn't belong to me. I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Machines beeped like impatient birds. The room smelled like antiseptic and plastic curtains. I saw flowers on the windowsill already wilting. And a note stuck beside them, Ellen. Stay, we need you. S. I didn't cry, I couldn't. But I felt something shift, a thread pulling me back. Sarah. My best friend since college. We lost touch for a while, but she always came back when it mattered. She was the one who stood beside my bed. She was the one who signed the papers. Later, she told me haltingly what happened. That my parents had been contacted. They came. Saw me hooked to tubes unresponsive. Heard the prognosis. And left. They said you weren't their legal concern, she whispered. No goodbye, no signature. Not even a hand on my shoulder. They didn't think I'd wake up. And honestly, I almost didn't. But Sarah stayed. She brought Chargers books, whispered podcast episodes near my ear just in case I could hear. She fought for me with the doctors. Argued with insurance. Posted updates online. Strangers cared more than the people who raised me. And when I finally spoke weeks later, the first thing I asked, voice raw, lips cracked, was, did they come back? Sarah looked away. And that told me everything. The first time I sat upright again, I cried. Not from pain. From the sheer absurdity of lifting my own weight. Of feeling something, anything, without help. My legs trembled like saplings in wind. I had to relearn how to hold a spoon. How to write my name. How to trust that my body would obey. Each day was measured in inches, not miles. But I was moving forward. Quietly. Alone. Until one afternoon, Sarah handed me my phone. I charged it. Figured you'd want to check your email. She meant well. But she didn't know what she was handing me. Among the spam and auto reminders, one subject line blinked like a warning notice of a state execution. Margaret Whitmore. My chest tightened. Grandma Margaret. The only person in that family who ever saw me. Really saw me. She used to send me postcards. To my lion-hearted girl, they said. She once gave me a bracelet with a tiny bent lion charm. Said it reminded her of me, quiet, strong, underestimated. I hadn't seen her in over a year. COVID. Excuses. And now she was gone. No call, no message. Just a cold email from a legal assistant. I stared at the screen, heart thudding. Sarah asked if I was okay. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. 2 weeks later, with trembling steps and Sarah by my side, I walked into Margaret's Victorian home in Cambridge. Dark wood floors, faint smell of lavender and old books. Dust on the window sills, but everything else in perfect order, just like she left it. Her photo was on the mantel. A black ribbon pinned to the corner. I stood there for a long time, breathing her memory, feeling like a trespasser in my own story. In the dining room, I found a stack of folders on the table. One was the preliminary draft of her will. I didn't open it. Instead, I opened my own. I had brought it all: hospital records, witness statements, a signed note from the attending physician. Even the security footage of Diane's voice saying, "She's not our real daughter." Proof. Of abandonment. Of silence. Of what they chose when no one was watching. I placed it inside a manila envelope, wrote the lawyer's name on the front, and left it right there on the polished oak. No anger. No revenge. Just truth. They were going to come. Of course they were. They always came when money was involved. But this time I would be waiting in my own way. Not with confrontation. Not with screams. With facts. With paper. With the one thing they couldn't erase. My name. The air in rehab smelled like bleach and boiled broccoli. They served coffee in tiny paper cups. No sugar. No cream. Just heat and bitterness. Every morning I rolled myself to the window and stared out at the parking lot. Old sedans. A broken lamppost. People arriving for visits. Not mine. I watched as husbands brought flowers. As daughters pushed mothers in wheelchairs down the path. As laughter drifted up from the courtyard. But no one came for me. Sarah called every evening. Sometimes she visited. She brought real coffee and dry shampoo and whispered stories from the outside world. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't family. And even though I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I was fine without them, the ache crept in anyway. It settled in my chest right behind the sternum. Heavy, quiet. Like a hand pressing down on my heart. One afternoon, Rachel, the nurse who had cared for me in ICU, stopped by during her break. She brought cookies. Store-bought but soft. "I thought you might want to know," she said, handing me one. "I found something in your file." I looked up. She hesitated, then pulled out a folded paper. It was a report. A summary of my intake the night of the crash. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, family notified. Refused to authorize further care. Left facility. My mouth went dry. They didn't just leave after the prognosis, Rachel said. They refused to help. The doctors told them I needed consent to continue treatment. They declined. I stared at the words. Black ink on white. Cold, final. I had known on some level. But reading it, that was different. That was real. My parents had chosen to let me die. Not by accident, not in confusion. But deliberately. I folded the page slowly. Pressed it against my chest. Rachel said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence between us was enough. Something broke inside me that day. Not loudly, not with drama. But like a shelf slowly splintering under weight it was never meant to hold. That night, I didn't sleep. The paper stayed under my pillow. I kept touching it like a splinter that wouldn't come out. Real, undeniable. I'd replayed the accident 1,000 times in my mind. How it must have felt for them to get that call. The panic. The fear. I thought maybe they just didn't know how to handle it. Maybe they were shocked, confused. But now I knew. They had made a choice. Not in the heat of grief. Not in panic. They listened to a prognosis and decided it wasn't worth it. I imagined Lily standing there beside them. Her perfect curls tucked behind her ears. Her arms crossed, saying nothing. Was she sad, silent, agreeing I didn't know? But she didn't stop them. She never did. I opened my laptop for the first time since the accident. The screen flickered brighter than I remembered. Notifications buzzed to life: calendar reminders, overdue emails, missed Slack messages, and then a photo. Sarah had taken it in the hospital. Me eyes closed, tubes everywhere. Beside me on the bedside table sat a pink bag from a boutique I loved. Inside, I later found chapstick, a phone charger, and a handwritten note. She was the one who stayed. Who chose me. No obligation, no blood. And it made me wonder, what does family really mean? If biology meant nothing in love, then maybe being adopted wasn't my wound. Maybe it was theirs. Maybe they were the ones who couldn't love outside their reflection. I scrolled through Lily's Instagram. Pictures of brunches, ski trips, her newest fiancé. One post caught my breath. A photo from my grandmother's house. The piano in the background. A caption, sorting through old memories. Miss you, Grandma, us, she'd gone. Already. They didn't tell me. They didn't wait. Grief came in sharp, unexpected waves. Not just for Margaret, but for the version of myself that still hoped, still believed one day they'd see me, choose me. That version died quietly right there in the rehab lounge. I closed the laptop, pulled the blanket higher, and for the first time in weeks I let the tears fall without shame. Not for them, for me. The day I left the rehab center, no one came to pick me up. Sarah had a meeting. The nurse helped me into the cab, folded my cane, and said, "You're tougher than most people I've met." I smiled even if my hands were shaking. Seattle in March was gray and forgiving. The sky matched the sidewalk. Everything felt quiet, like the city was making space for me to start again. My apartment smelled stale. Tea-stained mugs still on the counter. A basil plant had turned brown on the windowsill. I dropped my duffel and just stood there, breathing, listening, alive. The silence wasn't cruel. It was mine. I moved slowly those first days. Everything took longer. My brain lagged behind my hands. I'd forget words mid-sentence. Once I left the stove on until the smoke alarm screamed. But I made it through. One morning, as the kettle hissed and the sun sliced across the tile, I opened a letter from the law office of Mason and Birch. Execution of estate, Margaret Whitmore. Beneficiaries to be contacted shortly. I stared at the name. Whitmore. My name wasn't on the envelope, but I knew why I received it. She left something. Maybe money. Maybe just words. But she remembered me. I could feel it in my bones. That same day, I found a voicemail from Lily. "Hey, I know you've probably heard about Grandma. Just call me when you can." Her voice sounded flat. Not guilty, not apologetic, just careful. Like someone rehearsing empathy. I didn't call back. Instead, I dug through my files, pulled out every discharge note, every medical record. Printed the security log from the hospital, the one with the timestamp showing when Diane and Paul left, and I began to write. Not a letter of anger. Not vengeance. Just truth. I wrote what happened. What they chose. How Sarah signed. How Rachel stayed, and how I remembered every second of being abandoned while still breathing. I put it all in a folder. Labeled it plainly. For review, by Estate Counsel, Margaret Whitmore. It wasn't revenge. Not really, it was something else. Something sharper. Quieter. A way to say, you don't get to rewrite this. You don't get to take what you tried to bury. Not this time. Because I might have been the forgotten one. The invisible one. But I survived. And now they would have to read my name. Out loud. I didn't sleep the night I sealed the envelope. The folder sat on my kitchen table like a witness. Unmoving. Accusing. Waiting. Seattle rain drummed against the windows. It wasn't loud but steady. The kind of rain that seeps into everything, even thoughts. I boiled water for tea. Chamomile, though, I didn't believe it helped anymore. The cup warmed my palms, but not the cold sitting under my ribs. I reread the letter I'd written. 12 lines. No embellishment. No rage. Just what happened. And who didn't show up. Then I picked up my phone. It had been months since I'd texted Lily. The last message from her was dated the 14th of February, 2 days before my accident. Happy Valentine's, L. Hope someone out there is spoiling you. ATE. It felt like it came from another planet. I typed slowly. I heard about Grandma. I hope you're okay. Then I deleted it. I tried again. Did you go to the house already? Backspace that too. I ended up writing, you didn't tell me she died. I hit send. No emoji. No signature. No softening. Then I turned my phone face down. I wasn't ready for her reply, if there would even be one. Instead, I turned back to the folder. Inside were printed copies of my hospital records. One page detailed the Glasgow coma scale. Another listed Rachel as the attending nurse. Sarah's signature appeared 3 times. I'd added a timeline, phone calls made, messages unanswered, dates when I was intubated, when my parents visited, when they left. At the bottom, I attached a photo of myself from that week. Unconscious, bruised, unrecognizable. I wasn't trying to shock the lawyer. I just wanted him to see what they had turned away from, what they'd called not their responsibility. I had no idea what Margaret left behind. A bank account. A deed. A note tucked into a drawer. I didn't care about the money. What I cared about was the record. That somewhere in the official paperwork of our family's legacy the truth would live. And not just the one Diane and Paul rehearsed at dinner parties. Not the curated smiles, not the photo albums with my picture conveniently missing. The real one. The one with the silence. The decisions. The choice to leave. And my choice to stay standing. Lily replied 3 hours later. I thought Sarah would tell you. Everything happened so fast, I stared at the message for a long time. Not a sorry, not I should have called. Just a gentle sidestep, the kind Lily had mastered since we were kids. She never lied directly. She just disappeared behind timing and tone. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the window. The rain had stopped, but everything outside was soaked, the pavement shining like glass, the bus bench dripping steadily, the neighborhood cat curled on someone's porch shivering. I wrapped the manila envelope in brown craft paper, taped the corners flat. No ceremony, no dramatic flourish, just finality. I addressed it to the estate attorney listed in the notice, Atten Thomas L. Mason, private and confidential. It felt strange writing my name on the return corner. Ellen Carter. But not really a Carter was I. Not in their eyes. Not in the ones that mattered back then. I put it in my bag and walked 2 blocks to the post office. Every step steadied me. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed. An older man in a Seahawks cap helped me at the counter. Need this tracked and signed, I said. He weighed it silently, stamped it. Scanned the label. You want a receipt? Yes, and a photo if possible when it's delivered. He nodded. I paid in cash. Walked back slowly. The sky was turning that soft northwestern blue-gray. Muted. Lonely. Honest. That night, I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving. A gift from a client last year, organic French, probably overpriced. I poured 1 glass. Saturday by the window. And toasted the version of me that used to hope for an apology. She'd waited long enough. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't planning to scream or storm into family meetings. I just wanted the truth to exist. To breathe in the same rooms they pretended to mourn in. I wanted the weight of silence to fall on them, not because I shouted, but because I didn't. Because I had nothing left to explain. They knew what they did. And now so would someone else. 2 days later, I received an email from the law office. Short, formal. Miss Carter. We have received your submitted documents regarding the estate of Margaret Whitmore. A family meeting is scheduled for next week. Attendance is optional, but your presence is acknowledged. Thomas Mason, Esquire. I reread the lines. They weren't emotional. No thanks, no surprise. But I saw what I needed. Your presence is acknowledged. The irony made me laugh quietly, bitterly. After months of being forgotten in a hospital bed, after years of being invisible at family dinners, they were finally forced to acknowledge me. Not because I begged. Not because I bled louder, but because I documented everything. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I checked the delivery tracking. Signed for. By a woman named Connie at the front desk. I imagined it a quiet knock, a box cutter slicing the tape, Mr. Mason pulling out the folder. And the silence that would follow. I wondered what Diane would say when she saw the documents. If Paul would try to explain away the footage, if Lily would cry, I didn't know. And I didn't care. This wasn't about their feelings, this was about mine. For the first time in my life, I had told the story first. Not the one they rehearsed, not the one they curated, mine. And now it was written down, time-stamped, filed, unignorable. I spent the next few days in a strange quiet. I worked remotely, cooked more than usual, listened to classical music I used to hate, took slow walks around the block. I was waiting. But I wasn't powerless. The morning of the meeting, I pulled out a navy blue dress I hadn't worn in years. Sleek. Unapologetic. I laid it across the bed. Then I placed the lion charm bracelet on the nightstand. The one Margaret gave me when I was 13, it was bent, a little tarnished, but still whole. Just like me. That evening I looked in the mirror, really looked. Not for approval. Not for softness. For readiness. And I whispered, they don't get to erase me. Then I turned off the light. The morning of the meeting, I woke up before the alarm. It was still dark out. Seattle hadn't opened its eyes yet. The kitchen was cold. I wrapped my fingers around the mug as the kettle hissed. The warmth crept up my arms like something alive. I didn't drink the tea. I just held it. Outside, a crow landed on the fire escape. Its feathers gleamed slick against the fog. It stared at me for a second, then flew off. I took it as a sign. Doubt crept in as I dressed. What if they talked over me again? What if they smiled their way through everything like they always did? What if none of it mattered? I pulled the navy dress over my shoulders, zipped it up slowly like armor. The bracelet clinked as I fastened it. It hung loose now, my wrists thinner after months of recovery. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. They didn't shake, not today. The cab smelled like pine-scented air freshener and coffee. The driver didn't talk. Just played soft jazz through old speakers. My stomach turned as we crossed the bridge into Cambridge. Every corner held a memory. The bakery where Margaret used to buy lemon tarts. The library bench where I read for hours while Lily danced at rehearsals. The corner shop where I bought her last birthday card. She'd kept that card. I found it in her drawer beside a rosary and a bundle of handwritten recipes. To Margaret, I was never optional. That thought steadied me. The lawyer's office was a tall brick building just off Harvard Square. Quiet. Dignified. I stepped inside. The receptionist didn't look up as she buzzed me through. A glass-walled conference room waited at the end of the hall. Inside, I saw them. Diane in cream silk. Paul in a blazer too dark for morning. Lily with her hair in a soft braid, pretending calm. I stood outside for a full minute. Let the silence hold me. Then I opened the door. No one stood. No one said my name. But they all looked. And for once they didn't look through me. The chairs were already filled. Only one seat remained at the far end. I took it without asking. The cushion gave slightly under me. The room smelled faintly of leather and printer toner. Across the table, Diane's mouth was tight. She didn't smile. Didn't blink. Paul nodded once. A politician's nod, brief, useless. Lily looked away first. The lawyer entered. Mr. Mason, gray suit. Folders tucked under one arm. Calm voice, well-rehearsed. Thank you for coming. Let's begin. He started with formalities. Names. Dates. Legal obligations. I didn't speak. When he reached my name, he hesitated just slightly. Then Miss Ellen Carter is acknowledged in this estate as a named party. All submitted documentation has been reviewed and accepted. Paul shifted. Diane's fingers curled inward. Not clenched. Just controlled. Lily's head turned sharply. What documentation? She asked, her voice too light. Mr. Mason didn't flinch. There were materials submitted by Miss Carter outlining her medical history and relevant family involvement at the time of her injury. All of it has been reviewed. You were copied on the summary. Lily glanced at her phone, opened her mouth, then closed it. Diane broke the silence. That information was taken out of context. Her voice was smooth. Practiced. She was in critical condition. We weren't in a position to make long-term decisions. You walked out, Mr. Mason said evenly. That's what the hospital log confirms. That's what the footage shows. Timestamped. Verified. Paul cleared his throat. It was an emotional time. You must understand. No, the lawyer said. I'm not here to understand emotions. I'm here to execute Margaret Whitmore's will. He pulled out a new folder. Let's continue. He read aloud portions of the will. Some bequests were expected a donation to her church, a scholarship fund in her name. Then came the personal items, her jewelry, her recipes, her piano. And then, to my granddaughter Ellen, the one who has walked through fire and remembered who she is, I leave the Cambridge house. Because a house holds memory. And I know she'll protect it. The room went silent. Even the humming of the overhead light seemed to stop. Diane inhaled sharply. Lily blinked fast once, then again. I kept my eyes down, focused on my hands in my lap. Steady. Still. I didn't look at them. Not yet. My grandmother's words echoed in the room. To the one who has walked through fire. I remembered her voice. Warm. Dry with age but sharp with clarity. She once told me, don't raise your voice to be heard. Just make sure your words are true. Mr. Mason continued reading. Her handwritten letter separate from the legal will was included in the file. He unfolded it gently. Cleared his throat. I know they'll try to explain things away. But I've seen the difference between performance and presence. Ellen never needed to prove herself to me. She simply showed up. Over and over again. Diane shifted in her chair. Paul's hands were clasped tighter now. Then came the final clause. In the event of dispute, my lawyer will refer to the enclosed documentation submitted by Ellen Carter. If anyone questions my decision, I ask only this: read the records. And ask yourselves where you were when she needed you. Silence. Tangible. Cold. Like frost creeping across glass. Lily spoke first. I didn't know, she said softly. Her voice cracked on the second word. I looked up. For the first time, she wasn't polished. Her mascara had smudged beneath one eye. Her fingers trembled near her lap. I didn't know they left like that. Paul said nothing. Diane stayed still, jaw tight, arms crossed. Mr. Mason closed the folder. We can reconvene if needed. But for now the directives are clear. He stood. Professional, finished. Everyone else stayed seated. I stood slowly. The chair scraped against the floor, not loud, but final. Lily looked up. Ellen, she whispered. I paused. She looked like the girl I used to braid hair with. The one who used to sneak cookies to me when Mom said no. The one who forgot me when it mattered. I didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, I walked out. The hallway felt warmer than the room. Lighter. I stepped into the March air. It smelled of thawing snow and exhaust. Above me the sky was breaking open. Not clear. But no longer gray. For once I didn't feel like the one left behind. They could keep their explanations. Their discomfort. Their narratives. I had something they didn't. The truth. And a house filled with memory that now belonged finally to me. The plane ride back to Seattle was quiet. I didn't speak to the man next to me. Didn't touch the in-flight snacks. Just stared out the window as the sky turned from cold Massachusetts blue to soft northwestern gray. I kept replaying the moment I walked out of the lawyer's office. Not what I said, because I said nothing. But how it felt. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like finally dropping something I had carried too long. A stone I didn't realize was in my chest until it was gone. When I stepped into my apartment, it was as I left it. Sunlight pooling on the rug. The teacup still on the windowsill. That faint smell of old basil and laundry detergent. Home. I took off the navy dress. Hung it carefully. Then placed Margaret's lion charm bracelet back in its box. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. She believed in something I had barely begun to believe in myself, that being quiet didn't mean being weak. That some things don't need to be shouted to echo. The next morning my phone buzzed. Lily. Can we talk? I stared at the screen. The dots blinked, then stopped. A second message came. I didn't know how far it went. I should have asked more. Should have done more. Should have. The most useless verb in the English language. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because I didn't owe clarity to someone who watched me fade and never asked why. Later that day, I walked to my favorite cafe. The barista recognized me. "Hey, haven't seen you in a while." "The usual," yeah, I said, smiling softly. "Let's do the usual." He handed me the cup chai with oat milk. My name scribbled wrong as always. But it felt oddly comforting. I sat by the window. Watched people walk by, mothers with strollers. Teens in oversized hoodies. A woman on a bike with a basket full of lemons. Life kept moving. I wasn't bitter, I was tired. But not tired like before. Not the kind of tired that begged to be seen. This was the exhaustion that came from reclaiming your own breath, from standing still long enough to feel the ground return beneath you. And beneath all that resolve. 2 days later, I made an appointment, not a therapist. Not a doctor. A lawyer. Her office sat above a florist on Pike Street, 3rd floor, no elevator. I took the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, still not fully trusting my balance. Her name was Dana Levin. Sharp eyes. Silver streak in her hair, no small talk. "I reviewed the documents you sent," she said, flipping through a file already prepared. "Your grandmother's bequest is solid. Property transfer is clean, but I assume this isn't just about the house." "It's not," I said. "I want to make sure they can't take anything from me." "Not anymore." Dana nodded. "Meaning the Carters." I didn't correct her. "Yes. The Carters." She walked me through paperwork I didn't fully understand. Trust clauses. Property insurance. Letters of testamentary. Then she looked up. "Are you expecting them to contest it?" "No," I said, "but I want it in writing. That if they do, it will cost them." She smirked. "I can draft something airtight." I left her office lighter. Not because anything had changed, but because I had acted. No more waiting for someone to protect me. No more hoping someone would notice I needed defending. I was done being polite about survival. That night I found the keys Margaret had left. 3 total, 1 to the front door, 1 to the piano bench. And 1 I didn't recognize, small old brass. I held it between my fingers for a long time. It felt heavy for its size. Worn smooth from years of use. A note had come with the keys. Just 1 line written in Margaret's unmistakable script. "Use what they discard." I didn't know what she meant yet. But the words stayed with me. I booked a ticket back to Cambridge. Not for a confrontation. Not even for closure. For inventory. I needed to see what she'd left behind. Not just in legal documents, but in drawers, in corners and dust. Legacies don't always come with signatures. Sometimes they come with scent. With texture. With silence that still carries love. The house was colder than I remembered. Cambridge had shifted seasons again. The trees outside Margaret's window had turned pale green. New leaves, new start. I unlocked the door slowly. It stuck at the bottom. Paint swelling with age. Inside, the air smelled of lemon oil and thyme. Dust lingered in corners. The piano was still there. So were the curtains, stiff with starch. I dropped my bag by the staircase and stood in the center of the front room. No ghosts, just echoes. I walked through the dining room, my footsteps softened by an old rug I used to trace with my fingers as a child. The same brass lamp in the corner. The same scratches on the table from when I spilled juice and cried, and Margaret said, "Now it has a story." I started with the piano bench. The second key, inside sheet music. A cracked photo frame. And a worn leather notebook. Her handwriting covered every page. Recipes, quotes, memories. And 1 line circled twice, "Let truth be your quietest inheritance." I blinked hard. Closed the notebook gently. Upstairs, her bedroom was undisturbed. A blanket folded perfectly at the end of the bed. A lavender sachet still in the drawer, faint but familiar. I found the old jewelry box. Not much inside, just pieces she actually wore. Nothing flashy. Underneath it, taped to the bottom, was a small envelope. My name on it. In her hand. Inside, a deed. Not for the house. For a small piece of land near the harbor. And a note. They always chased what sparkled. You saw what held. Build something, Ellen. Build it your way. I sat on the edge of her bed, letter in hand, sunlight striping across the floor. I didn't cry, I just breathed. For the first time, not as someone asking to be included, but as someone entrusted. Margaret had seen me. Not through the lens of obligation or guilt, but for who I really was. Not loud, not flashy, just enduring. And now I had something they'd never touch. Not because I hid it, but because it wasn't meant for them. It was meant for me. If someone gave you a blank space after everything, would you build or walk away? The land Margaret left me wasn't large, just a narrow triangle of earth tucked behind the harbor. Once part of a shipyard, now overgrown with thistle and gravel. But it had a view. A good one, and no one knew it existed except me. I stood on it one early morning, wind biting through my sleeves. The water lapped against the old stone edge. A single gull circled overhead, crying like it had something to prove. In the distance, the city moved on without me. But here time stalled. And for the first time since I'd signed discharge papers, I didn't feel like I was catching up. I was deciding. I sat on an overturned crate, took out a notepad, and began to sketch. Nothing grand. Just ideas. A reading space. Maybe a garden. A small structure with lightwood wide windows and no locks. Not a business. Not a brand. Something for women like me, who'd been told they were almost technically or not quite. Who came second in rooms they helped build. Who kept records in silence while everyone else played victim in public. A place to sit, to breathe. To write down truths and not be asked to prove them. I didn't need a legacy that shouted. I needed one that lasted. That evening, I called Sarah. She answered on the second ring. I was wondering when you'd call. I smiled. I found something. Something good. There was a pause. Tell me everything, she said. So I did. I told her about the land. The note. The idea. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said softly, Ellen, you're doing it. You're building something they can't touch. I didn't reply right away. I looked out the window. Seattle was soft again. That dusky early spring kind of light that made everything look like it had been washed clean. They never saw me, I said. Not really. Sarah's voice didn't waver, but they will now. And not because you screamed, because you stayed. I closed my eyes. Let the weight of that land settle somewhere deeper than my bones. It wasn't about proving anymore. It was about becoming. I started with a sketch, then another, then a spreadsheet. I'd forgotten how grounding it was to build something from the bones, not code this time, but something you could walk inside of. Sarah connected me with an old friend, Ava, a freelance architect who worked mostly on community spaces. When we met, I laid everything on the table. Literally. A map of the lot. Photos of the surrounding fence. Margaret's letter. Ava didn't ask for big visions. She just listened. Then she said, let's build it quiet and strong. We named it the table. Not a center. Not a retreat. Just a place where women like me could come, not to be saved, but to be heard. A shared table. A reading nook. A soundproof room for those who needed to cry, scream, or breathe. It didn't need to be large, just enough. The paperwork took weeks. City permits, soil tests, zoning history back to the 1950s. One official looked at me sideways and said, "You sure you want to use that land? It's nothing special." I smiled politely. It is to me. Margaret had left me not the biggest piece, but the one no one else saw value in. Exactly like she saw me. That irony wasn't lost on me as I mailed in the application form, sat through virtual meetings, called inspectors. Sarah sent me a mug that read, "Paperwork is power." I used it daily. Each task, each tiny approval felt like a brick being laid. Not just in Cambridge but in me. One evening, while reviewing a floor plan revision, I got another message from Lily. Saw your name in the community board update. Are you building something? No question about why. No mention of Margaret, no apology. Just curiosity dressed as kindness. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't want her near this. This wasn't for the family that left me. It was for those who'd ever been left. And every email I sent, every form I filed felt like a seed in the soil they once deemed worthless. The first delivery arrived on a Monday morning. 3 cedar planks, 2 bags of soil, and a box of mismatched screws. I signed for them myself. No ribbon. No press release. Just me standing in boots on uneven dirt holding a clipboard. Ava met me at the lot later that afternoon. She brought coffee and her sleeves rolled up. We walked the space again, marking corners with flags and stones. This is where the bench goes, I said, pointing. Facing east. I want the light to hit first thing in the morning. She nodded, made a note. We talked about drainage, insulation, reclaimed windows. But the real conversation was unspoken. We were making something that had never been made for people like me. Not a monument, not a pity project. A shelter without rescue. A place to land without explaining the fall. At night, I reviewed expenses. Built a simple website, just a single page, no email list, no bio. At the top, one sentence: come as you are. Stay as long as you need. I didn't share it widely. But somehow word traveled. A barista from the cafe messaged me. A woman in my old coding group donated a stack of chairs. One nurse from the hospital, Rachel, sent me a handwritten card and a small lamp. Inside, you're still here. I never forgot. I placed that lamp in the east corner, next to the bench. One morning I brought a photo of Margaret, black and white. She was young, standing on a beach, hair pinned back, smiling like the wind had dared her to. I framed it in wood and hung it by the window. She would have liked the view. And the silence. No footsteps behind me. No voices asking why I was allowed to be here. Just air, light, possibility. Sarah flew in for the weekend. We painted the interior ourselves, soft, eggshell, nothing glossy. She stood in the middle of the room when we finished, hands on hips. You realize this is the most rebellious thing you've ever done, right? I laughed. It caught in my throat. I didn't build this to rebel, I said. I built it so no one has to sit in a hospital bed wondering if they're worth saving. Sarah didn't speak. She just hugged me. Tight, still. We stood there for a long time. 2 women, 1 room, a table between us. And something beginning. We didn't call it a grand opening. There were no balloons, no speeches. No sign with my name on it. Just an open door, a pot of tea, and chairs that didn't match. We called it the soft day. Soft because it wasn't loud. Soft because it didn't need to be anything else. Sarah handled logistics. Ava set up the donation box by the back window. I arranged the books. No one asked who funded it. No one questioned why it was here. They simply walked in slowly, curiously, as if they'd been looking for it without knowing it. One woman brought banana bread. Another left a note in the corner jar. I didn't think I was allowed to rest. Thank you. I stood by the window pouring tea. Soft jazz hummed through the speakers. The room smelled of cedar and something sweet from the kitchen. Then the door opened again. And everything went still. Diane. And behind her, Lily. They didn't belong. And somehow they knew it. Diane wore pearls. Her expression was unreadable. Controlled. Lily had her arms crossed, but her eyes flickered everywhere. I didn't move. Didn't step forward. Didn't invite them in. But I didn't turn away either. They walked in slowly. No words. Just footsteps on new wood. Diane paused near the bookshelf. Ran her fingers along the spine of a memoir written by a woman whose son stopped speaking to her. She didn't pull it out. Lily stopped in front of the photo by the window. Margaret. Smiling into the wind. She stared longer than I expected. Then turned toward me. Our eyes met. She opened her mouth, then closed it, looked down. I offered her nothing. Not because I was cruel, but because I had already offered enough. More than enough. I didn't need an apology. Not here. Not in this space. Let them feel the weight of absence, the absence of control, the absence of explanation, the absence of me bending to fill the silence. They didn't stay long. Lily lingered by the door for a moment. Then followed Diane out slowly. When the door clicked shut behind them, someone asked, "Friends of yours?" I smiled, poured another cup of tea, and said, "Not anymore." After they left, the room felt lighter. Not like a storm had passed, more like a window had been opened. People kept coming. A woman in her 60s brought cuttings from her backyard rosemary bush. A high school girl sat cross-legged in the reading corner sketching in silence. No one asked for permission. They just arrived. I lit a candle in the far window. Not for ceremony. Just scent. Cedar and cardamom. Warm. Grounded. Later that afternoon, someone tapped my shoulder. I turned. Rachel. The nurse from the hospital. Her smile was hesitant, like she wasn't sure I'd remember. But I did. "Hey," she said, "you look alive." I laughed, more from relief than humor. She handed me a brown envelope. "I saw the article," she said. "It showed up in the community journal. I wasn't sure if I should reach out." Inside the envelope were two things: a copy of the hospital log and a note handwritten in small block letters. "I was there when they left. I always wondered if you'd want this. Now I know. You don't need it. But you earned it." I looked up. Rachel's eyes were glassy. "I've never forgotten you," she said. "Not just because of what happened, but because of how you fought back quietly. You reminded me why I became a nurse." I didn't have words, so I hugged her, not tightly. Just long enough. In the background, the sound of soft pages turning. Laughter in the corner. A teacup clinked against a saucer. This wasn't just a room anymore, it was becoming something else. Something layered. Something made of all the moments I thought I'd never survive. Sarah walked past with a tray of cookies. "I think you started something," she said, grinning. I looked around. She was right. This wasn't a reaction. It wasn't about them anymore. Not Diane, not Paul, not even Lily. This was a reclamation. And I wasn't standing in the shadows of their choices. I was standing in the light of mine. 3 days later, I received an email from Thomas Mason. Subject line: "Final acknowledgement, estate resolution." I opened it slowly, though I already knew what was inside. "Dear Miss Carter, per your grandmother's directives and the documentation on file, the remaining items of personal property have been released from contention. Diane and Paul Carter have withdrawn any formal inquiry. No further action will be taken by their representation. Consider the matter closed. T. Mason." No apology, no message from them. Just withdrawal. Just silence. Exactly how they left me, quiet, legal, finished. But this time, I wasn't the one left behind. I didn't forward the email. Didn't print it. Didn't screenshot it for Sarah. I just stared at it once, then hit archive. Later that evening, I went back to the table. It was quiet. Just past closing hours. The lamps glowed low and golden. Bookshelves leaned with new donations. A pair of slippers sat by the window. Someone must have forgotten them. I walked barefoot across the wooden floor. Saturday at the long table with a blank journal. No one around. No expectations. I wrote one sentence: "Justice didn't roar." It arrived and sat down beside me. I closed the notebook. Tucked it on the shelf marked "Stories Still Becoming." Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a soft rush. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed the hour. I thought about Diane's face in the lawyer's office, composed, tight, proud. I thought about Lily blinking at the photo of Margaret, her mouth half open like a question she'd never learned how to ask. And then I thought about Margaret. How she saw what didn't sparkle. How she planted her hope in quiet places. How she left just enough room for me to grow. I turned out the lights one by one. Locked the door behind me. The key clicked with a sound that felt not like finality, but presence. This time I wasn't shutting anything out. I was holding something in. And it was mine. Spring settled in slowly. At the table, light arrived earlier each morning. Soft golden bands slipping across the floorboards like a promise no one had to keep. We added cushions to the reading nook. A community board by the door. No rules, just a cork wall where people left scraps of things, quotes, dried petals, recipes scribbled on napkins. One woman pinned a note that said, "Today I left the house." That's enough, and we all agreed it was. I didn't oversee everything. That wasn't the point. Some days I just restocked tea, wiped windows, repaired a chipped tile. On Thursdays I brought scones from the bakery down the road, the same one Margaret used to love. They never got her order right. She never corrected them. "That's how news stories begin," she'd say. "Let the world misname you. Then rename yourself." I think about that every time someone walks in and says, "I don't know what this place is exactly," and I say, "It doesn't have to be anything. You're here, that's enough." One afternoon, I found Lily's name on the donation ledger. No message. Just a scribbled L, Carter, and $100 check. I didn't return it. I didn't think her either. Some things don't need closure. They just need to stay behind the door you choose not to reopen. The lawyer sent a final letter by mail. Official seal. Thick paper. It confirmed I now held sole custodianship of the land and house. No disputes filed. All parties notified. I ran my thumb over the embossed gold edge. Then slipped it into a drawer beneath spare keys and extra postcards. That night I sat on the porch as dusk settled in. Birdsong gave way to wind. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and sipped chamomile. The city moved quietly beyond the trees. Inside, a kettle whistled. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt neither watched nor forgotten. Just here. Weeks passed. The house no longer creaked like a stranger. It breathed with me. Responded to footsteps. Held silence like a friend who doesn't ask questions. One afternoon, I found an old recipe card tucked inside a gardening book. Margaret's handwriting again. Peach bread. For heavy days. She'd written little notes beside each line. Too much sugar, keep it anyway. Use real cinnamon, not the cheap stuff. Don't rush, let the scent fill the room before you slice. I baked it that evening. The whole house smelled like August. I didn't eat it all. I left a few slices by the window with a sign. Take what you need. They were gone by morning. No one said thank you. No one had to. Legacy, I was learning, wasn't always made of stone. Sometimes it was a bench. A quiet corner. A loaf of bread on a napkin. Sometimes it was simply the choice to stay when you had every reason to leave. I never heard from Paul again. Diane sent one letter typed unsigned. It said something about misunderstanding and heartbreak and how family fractures. I didn't finish reading it. I didn't burn it either. I just folded it back into its envelope, placed it inside the drawer with the deed and the final letter from Mr. Mason. That drawer became my boundary. Not locked, but closed. A reminder that justice didn't always end with applause. Sometimes it just meant you no longer had to explain your absence. One Saturday, a young woman named Kiera came in. She was quiet. Looked down a lot. Wore long sleeves in the middle of spring. She didn't speak for the first hour. Just sat at the table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. Before she left, she asked, "Is this place for people who weren't chosen?" I met her eyes. And said, "It's for people who kept showing up anyway." She nodded. Wrote something in the journal near the window. Then walked out, shoulders a little straighter. I didn't read what she wrote. I didn't need to. The page she left open held only 3 words: I'm still here. So was I. So was this place. And maybe that was the point all along. The harbor was quieter in early summer. Boats floated like they had nothing to prove. Children's laughter echoed across the dock, thin as thread. I stood on the same patch of land where this all began. The first time I came here, my hands were still healing. My walk was unsteady. And the only thing I was sure of was that I didn't want to feel invisible anymore. Now I stood with both feet firm on the ground. Not needing to be seen, only needing to be real. I ran my fingers along the old fence post. The paint had flaked away in layers, white, then blue, then wood beneath. Time leaving its own signature. Margaret never asked me to build anything specific here. She just left the space. And trusted that I would know what it was for. I didn't turn it into a cafe or a monument. I planted a row of saplings, 3 so far. Each one marked with a name, not of people, but of words no one gave me when I needed them. Belonging. Steadiness. Enough. I come here sometimes with a journal. Not to write chapters. Just fragments. Lines that feel like bone, small truths that once lived in my mouth as questions but now sit quietly as knowing. Across the water, a fairy horn called out once low and certain. I watched it disappear into the fog. Not lost. Just moving forward. I sat on the bench beneath the second sapling. The breeze carried salt and cut grass. Birds danced on the power lines. I thought of Lily. Of the first time we rode bikes down this very road, her streamers whipping in the wind and me pedaling hard just to keep up. We were children. But even then she was chosen, and I was always proving. Now I didn't chase, I had arrived. Not to them, to myself. Margaret had once told me, "Don't let pain teach you the wrong story." And I hadn't. I let it teach me what I deserved, and what I could grow. Right here in the quiet. On land no one fought for but me. That Friday 5 new women showed up. No one announced them. They didn't come all at once, they just appeared one by one. One was holding a folded grocery bag, another had paint on her fingers. A third wore sunglasses indoors and never took them off. I didn't ask questions, I just poured tea. They took seats slowly, cautiously, like the room might vanish if they moved too fast. After a while someone spoke. "I haven't said my husband's name out loud in 6 months. Another woman whispered, "I forgot what my voice sounds like when I'm not asking for something." The third only said, "I'm tired of explaining." And the fourth, who hadn't spoken at all, just reached for the small box of tissues at the edge of the table. No one told her it was okay. She didn't need permission. They stayed for hours. Some wrote. Some listened. One stared at the bookshelf and didn't touch a thing. When they left, the room felt warm in a way I couldn't name. Sarah came by later to help clean. We worked in quiet sink, stacking mugs, fluffing cushions, straightening books. She paused, held up a journal left behind. "Should we keep this?" I opened it to the first page. In big looping ink, I thought I had disappeared. But then I found the door open. I closed the cover, placed it gently in the wooden box beneath the reading nook, where we kept stories too new to end. Later that night, I walked home under a sky that still held the color of dusk. A soft blue-gray that looked like memory. Passing windows glowed with other people's lives, families eating dinner, someone folding laundry, laughter from a second-floor apartment. I didn't feel left out, I felt adjacent. And somehow that was enough. I had my own windows now. My own light. No longer asking to be welcomed in. No longer waiting on someone to say I mattered. I had created something that didn't need proof. And in doing so, I had proven everything. I woke up early on the last Sunday of the month. The air had that stillness only morning knows. No wind, no cars. Just the hush of a world not yet awake. I brewed coffee instead of tea. Let the bitterness remind me I was alive. Then I walked to the table alone. No one knew I was coming. That was the point. Inside, everything was where it belonged. Books leaned, chairs waited. A lamp glowed from the timer Sarah had set the night before. I sat at the corner desk, opened the drawer that held Margaret's photo, and beside it I placed a small plaque. Just a simple strip of wood. Hand-carved. 4 words founded by Ellen Carter. I didn't ask for applause. I didn't expect anyone to notice. But I needed it there for the girl I used to be. The one who never saw her name on a family tree, on a school list, on a holiday card. Now it lived on a space she built herself. And it would stay. Even if no one pointed at it. Even if the letters faded. Later, I walked to the bench at the harbor. The saplings had grown. One was taller than me now. The one marked enough. I sat there with my journal and wrote I wasn't erased. I was replanted. In better soil. And that's the truth. Diane and Paul faded into the background. Their absence no longer felt like loss. Just distance. And I didn't need to cross it. Lily sent one last message in spring. I saw your place in a magazine. You made something good, I mean that. I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. I let it sit there like a pebble at the edge of the shore. Not hurting, not needed, just left behind. One day someone will ask where all this started. I'll tell them about a letter, a nurse. A woman who planted seeds she never lived to see bloom. But mostly I'll tell them this: sometimes justice doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it shows up as a key, a table, a name you finally give yourself without asking anyone's permission. Thank you for listening to my story. Where are you listening from? Have you ever had to rebuild from silence? Share your journey below. You're not alone. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real-life stories of quiet justice, healing, and empowerment.